first of all, allow me to echo the sentiments of all my predecessors on stage in expressing our gratitude to the Chanakya forums and in particular to Major Gaurav Arya and his indefatigable team of miracle workers. Here too on stage we have a very illustrious panel. You've already been introduced to them, and if I was to try and introduce them to you, we would take up the balance of the time available to me. So I'm going to ask them to first give a few minutes of opening comment about what their views are in respect of the PLA Navy and its implications upon the growth and the security both of Indian Navy and India as a country. Before that, there are a couple of points that I thought I would ask the audience to reflect upon. The first is, why do we feel that China is going to be here at all? What is it that drives China into the Indian Ocean? Why can't China simply be satisfied with being the predominant power in the East China Sea and the South China Sea? And the answer to that, of course, is the simple fact that the Chinese economy is in far greater trouble than we often give them, than we often think. The Chinese situation in terms of their demand for energy is so large and their demand for markets is so large that China is not in the Indian Ocean because it desires to surround India. There is no string of pearls in the Chinese concept. The Chinese are in the Indian Ocean or will be in the Indian Ocean because their economy demands that they be here. And because of that, there are investments being made all around, and therefore the question, is China plotting to surround India? The answer is no. Is India getting surrounded? The answer is yes. So it's a bit like, for those of you who speak Hindi here, it's a bit like the chaku and the kharbuja. Whether the chaku hits the kharbuja or the kharbuja hits the chaku, both times is bad for the kharbuja. India, we are the kharbuja. The next point is that there is a requirement to understand that China and India are driven by the same philosophies of balanced growth. Neither of them have allies and neither of them have alliances to which they can turn for the provision of one or another kind of platform. And this brings us to an important point about the difference between capacity and capability, both for China as well as for India. And capacity is simply material wherewithal, ship, aircraft, submarine, this room, headquarters, dockyard, all this is capacity. If we have this really fancy room, we have great capacity. If we fill it with idiots, then we have no capability. And China has therefore no option, nor does India, but to maximize its capability along with its capacity. Now, India is doing 100 times better than China in this regard, which is something that you will hear about. Last point I want to talk to you about before handing over the panel is this business of bases and places. Now, you must understand that everything is not a base. A military base has to be defended in combat. A place is something from where you will get ISR. And therefore, Djibouti is not a base for China. It's a place. In times of combat, China cannot defend Djibouti. In times of combat, America can defend Diego Garcia. In times of combat, Yokosuka is a base in Japan because the Japanese will defend it. But Eritrea is not a base for China. And therefore, we must appreciate what is a base, what is a place, and in times of conflict, whether the places that you invested in become strengths or become liabilities. With that as the overview, let me first turn to Admiral Monty Khanna and ask him for his views on the huge Chinese military expenditure in terms of their, especially their naval budget, and whether or not you think it actually translates into actual capacities and actual capabilities and relevant to India. Monty.
Thank you, sir, for giving me this opportunity. So let me jump straight into this topic. The fundamental bedrock of all power is economic power, because economic power is fungible. When you look at the Chinese defense budget, the last budget was 1.67 trillion yuan. Going to be a whole lot of numbers in this. which comes to 231 billion US dollars. Now, there are various agencies that do a course correction for this because the way countries count the defense budget is slightly different. So you have IISS, you have the US DoD report, you have CIPRI, etc. And the normal markup that is done for the Chinese defense budget is roughly by an amount of around 50%, 40 to 50%. So that $31 billion becomes $330 billion is the sum that you're looking at. Now, how much is that? And this is without making a PPP, a purchasing power parity correction, right? So this is only in real terms. Now, how much of that money is spent towards their capital budget is the next issue. So there are many people who do this study, and the normal figure that everyone comes up to is roughly around 40% of the US spending is on capital. For India, it is 27%. So there's a substantial difference. And I think that difference is justified because when you look at the budgetary differential, it is 1:3 between India and China. And that is without making the CIPRI correction. If you look at that correction, it is 1:4.5. But when you look at the manpower differential, it is 1:1.45 because they're roughly around 2 million and we are around 1.45 million or so. So if you see that difference, you will see that 40% seems to be fairly fair. Now comes the next issue is so that 40% comes to roughly around 132 billion is the capital spending. What percentage of that goes to the Navy is the next question. So the Navy, in fact, today is receiving, by many analysts, is receiving the largest chunk of Chinese defense funding. And the normal figure that people come around to is around 30%. 30%, you have there's a ground force, there's the air force, of course, there are rocket forces, and there are the four commands and the new structure that they've got. So 30% now, from that 132 billion, you're down to around $39 billion. Now, on this, if you do a purchasing power parity correction, you bump up that number because the difference between the Chinese purchasing power and their nominal value is roughly 1:2. So now you're up to around 70 to 75 billion is their naval capital budget. We at 62,000 crores, the figure that was given this morning by the CNS, are at $7.5 billion, 10 times. 10 times is the number, is the number. It's quite a startling number. It might be off, it might be around 8 times, but between 8 to 10 times is Chinese defense spending in the naval budget. And therefore, we have to focus on asymmetry. Now, if you've got the money, how do you translate this money into assets is the next issue. Chinese shipyards, right? More than 400 shipyards, 7 to 8 of them engaged in defense construction. The shipyard sizes are colossal. I mean, you take JNCX, 2,500 acres. Mazagon Docks, 70 acres. Goa Shipyard, 30 acres. Cochin Shipyard, 165 acres. You add up all our shipyards together, you're short of 1,000 acres. A single shipyard over there, 2,500 acres. If you take JNCX again, I mean, in terms of orders, and these are commercial orders also, 55.7% of all orders placed last year globally placed on China. New orders, 74%. So moving ahead, it's going to be even more. In terms of submarine construction, you take Hurudao Shipyard in Bohai. They've recently, in the new reclamation they've done, set up 21 new final assembly halls for nuclear submarine construction. You take all the nuclear submarine shipyards in the world, they won't come up to 21. So what does this all finally translate it into is roughly you're looking at a 500 plus Navy, or the PLA Navy. What would be the constituents of this Navy? I would say around 20 large decks, and that large decks includes aircraft carriers, LPDs, LHAs, LHDs, etc. 100 destroyers, 100 frigates, 75 attack submarines. This is where the real change is going to be. 75 attack submarines, 20 strategic submarines, 50 conventional submarines, 50 plus expeditionary assets, 50 plus support assets, and 50 plus science and technology assets. So this would be, I would say, the broad making of the Chinese navies.
Thank you very much, Monty. That was both fascinating and scary. Let me ask Commodore Anil Jaisingh to give us some balance. Not every Chinese endeavor is made by people who are 10 feet tall. And it's not that the Chinese pace of shipbuilding, no matter how impressive, is without its challenges and its constraints intrinsic to explosive military growth. So, AJ, would you be so kind as to offer your views on this, and then we come to questions a bit later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, and thank you, Chanakya Dialogues, for this opportunity. Admiral Monty Khanna has just given us a fascinating overview of the Chinese naval expansion and its defense priorities towards defense build-up. Well, in 2024, the PLA Navy celebrated its 75th anniversary of its founding, and which broadly actually coincides with the period 1947 to 1950, when the Royal Indian Navy transitioned into the post-partition Indian Navy. So our growth pattern probably began around the same time. We were probably a little larger than the PLA Navy at that point of time, but not appreciably larger. Both navies are endeavoring to build a balanced, multi-dimensional blue water force with full spectrum capability. Only thing is that the growth trajectory has been somewhat different. The Chinese really took off 4 decades ago, not necessarily 75 years ago. And in these 4 decades, the PLA Navy has grown into a very formidable force. In fact, it is already numerically, as Admiral Monty Khanna brought out, the largest navy in the world with over 350 ships and submarines, and endeavors to be a 450-ship navy by 2030 or so. So, if you really look at it, you know, as the Chief of Naval Staff had mentioned in an earlier talk, the Chinese Navy is adding an Indian Navy to its force level every 8 years. Now, that's a phenomenal rate of growth. And this expansion is expected to continue till 2030, at least maybe 2035, by which time the Chinese Navy, PLA Navy expects to have about 450 ships and submarines in commission, as also Admiral Khanna brought out. By comparison, if you look at it, the Indian Navy has been steadily growing, but at a far more sedate pace. It is true that numbers matter and quantity has its own quality. But it is also true that a weapon platform is only as good as the man behind it. And here I'd like to highlight 3 issues pertaining to this rapid growth of the Chinese Navy. Firstly, you know, Admiral Fleet Cunningham had said it takes 3 years to build a ship, but it takes 300 years to build a navy. So the Chinese Navy growing at this pace of 20 to 25 ships a year, 20 to 25 large ships a year, I really wonder where their manpower is coming from. Because the Indian Navy went through not a comparative growth rate, but in the mid 80s, early 90s, I was on board submarines at that time, as was Monty, and we acquired 12 submarines within a period of 8 years. And we felt the strain on manning, you know, getting the right kind of experienced manpower, training them rapidly, bringing them up to speed. Here they're building ships with crews of 300 and 400 and 500. Now, to be able to train so many people so rapidly, no matter how good your training may be, no matter how good your academies might be, but finally at sea, it's experience that counts. And as these platforms get more and more sophisticated, they will need more people who have experience on the equipment rather than people who come out of academies with a lot of theoretical training. So I think that at the moment could be a sort of weakness that the Chinese Navy has, despite its impressive numbers. But let me also add that it's a weakness they're probably aware of and are therefore doing everything to mitigate this. The second thing is I think the biggest challenge that PLA Navy might face when it comes to getting ready as a combat-ready force would be this dichotomy between the political leadership and the military leadership. The Chinese armed forces have been very categorically told that their first loyalty lies to the party. Every ship or submarine in the PLA Navy has a political commissar on board. The political commissar's job is the political ideology and the political indoctrination of the people on board. This has a twofold effect. Firstly, it eats into valuable training time. I read somewhere that 40% of the training time is actually spent on political indoctrination rather than actual training on naval assets. And secondly, and this we can talk from personal experience, having a political commissar on board, he's a very powerful guy. He has nothing to do with the combat effectiveness of the platform. His one and only job is to ensure that the crew toes the party line. And very often he comes into conflict with the captain of the ship. And at times he overlords the captain of the ship because he says, I'm the political guy and I call the shots. And this is not good for command and control. This is not good for a platform. This is not good for a navy. We have seen this when we were training in the Soviet Union in 85, 86 and went on board our submarine, but was still not handed over to us. In the control room one day, there used to be called the Zampolit, the Zamestitel Politicheskaya or whatever. The Zampolit and the captain had a major showdown, the Russian captain, to the extent that people had to leave the control room. That was the level of shouting that was going on between the two of them on who is actually in command of that vessel. Now, this is absolutely anathema to any command and control structure in the armed forces. So this is another vulnerability which I think China will need to address, is about its political ideology taking precedence over the military and combat capability.
AJ, I hate to cut in to your explanation, but I want to bring Agnihotri in for a minute or two, and then unless you have one last point that you wish to make.
I'll just make one more point.
Yep.
The third thing I think is about the quality. Now, we've heard often that Chinese equipment is not of good quality. I mean, there's no way to prove that, except to see that, for example, the Thai Navy. The Thai Navy recently cancelled an order for 3 submarines from China because the Germans refused to give them engines, and they'd been promised German engines. So when the Chinese offered Chinese engines for their submarines, the Thais cancelled the order. And I believe the Pakis are also a little concerned that their Hangar class are also going to get Chinese engines. And I think that is the third issue, is about the quality of equipment, but that is something we cannot comment on because I've never been on a Chinese warship. But it could be an issue, and again, it's an issue that they will overcome sooner rather than later. And the fourth issue, sir, I'll just take 30 seconds, is because of all these factors, perhaps the Chinese Navy, and its rapid growth, perhaps the Chinese Navy yet does not have the confidence to operate in its far abroad the way it should be doing with the kind of force levels it has. We've not heard of a single carrier-based deployment going beyond the second island chain so far, the PLA Navy. And only last year in September was the first time ever that they did a dual carrier exercise with both their aircraft carriers. So I think they're still learning the ropes on this. And that's why I think, notwithstanding all these things, if at all they're having an effect on the PLA Navy, we should not be lulled into complacency, but should be careful to see that they'll be addressing all these issues sooner rather than later. I'll stop at that and wait for the Q&A, sir.
Thank you so much. And now we have Captain Agnihotri, because the whole day today we have heard the repetition of the word technology. And for sure, Chinese technology is a fairly advanced set of technologies. And to dilate upon some of the ones which impact the maritime domain, affect India, and in particular the subsurface maritime domain, I think Captain Agnihotri, maybe you can shed some light.
Thank you, sir. We have seen that the fundamental goal of Chinese national defense is resolute protection of the national sovereignty and the overseas interests. Now, the moment overseas interest comes in, obviously it falls into the domain of far seas, and that's how the PLA Navy's role becomes critical. Now, the PLA Navy talks about the safeguarding of maritime rights and protection of its overseas interests, which of course means the protection of its overseas citizens, the institutions and organizations. And for this, it requires the operation in far seas, and that is why we find increasing number of PLA Navy ships which are highly technologically equipped come into the Indian Ocean region. At any one point of time, there are at least 6 PLA Navy ships and 6 odd so-called support ships or auxiliary ships. Now, while PLA Navy ships, I will leave it for the time being, because that is what the moderators have asked about. The other support ships are highly technologically endowed. Now we see the presence of the intelligence collection ships, the Tongtiao class. We see the Yuan Wang class ships, which are space telemetry and tracking ships coming in. We see the deep sea research vessels, which have also got the manned and unmanned submersibles on board for deep sea research. And we have got the hospital ship, we have got training ships, and we have got the other kind of technologically endowed ships. Now it is no secret that the deep sea research ships and survey ships, which often come here at the invitation of our friends, our neighbors like Maldives and Sri Lanka, come and operate, and they do seabed mapping, they do data collection, hydrological data collection, seawater density, salinity, and temperature profiling, which will prove to be highly advantageous when China plans its submarine operations and undersea warfare during the time of hostilities. Now, all this is fine, but you also require a support for near real-time communication, so that there is a seamless command and control available with the control centers back home. So for that, they have got the, I would say, exclusive use of their own global coverage Peitao satellite navigation system. they have got the Yaogan series of ISR satellites, which are in multi-domain, multi-mode, multi-application. And in that context, I would like to talk, I'll just close this thing by giving certain data about the latest set of Yaogan satellites.
Kamlesh, I think we'll leave it at that because we are clean out of time. And I want 1 minute available to each of the speakers to just tell us about what your view is on the impact on India. We really have got very little time, so if you wouldn't mind. Maybe we lead off in the same direction, Monty? But keep it short.
So if you're talking about mitigations, very briefly, I can just list out a few. First is leverage geography. So our geography is peculiar. You share a common land border. From a maritime standpoint, you're 4,000 miles apart at least. And therefore, I would think that if you have to draw them into battle, draw them in the Indian Ocean and not, the Indo-Pacific construct is an American construct. Our primary area of operations should be the Indian Ocean. Threat of trade interdiction. If one of the reasons why China is scared about, is coming here is to address protect their trade, you have to exacerbate that threat for them. And therefore, that threat has to be prioritized. Reprioritization of force structure and I think the time has come where you have to adapt from your service from being a capability-based service to an extent become a threat-based service if you perceive the Chinese threat to be as real as it is. This will require, you require theaterization, of course, because that's combat power for free. You have to reduce duplication. You have to have coherent application of force. You require a supreme commander who can, choreograph the application of force, and that comes through a theater commander. Structural reform, of course. Capital to asset generation ratio. This is a fundamental issue for us that we're not being able to leverage our purchasing power parity advantage. If the Indian rupee is undervalued by a factor of 4, buying Indian should be 1/4 the cost. It never happens that way. We're almost at par. So in that sense also, sir. And lastly, I would say is, engage in focused operations, and a certain amount of external balancing is essential, and that you'll have to do, sir.
Thank you very much. I know there's much more to be said, but time is not on our side. So
I'll just make 3 very quick points, sir, in less than a minute, hopefully. Firstly, why is the Indian Ocean so important to China? As Monty Khanna brought out, Chinese trade and energy travels through the Indian Ocean. It's a vulnerability they understand, and they would like to mitigate it and provide whatever forces are required to mitigate this vulnerability, whether from India or from anybody else. The second thing is that it's only the Indian Ocean which gives China the sea space which it will require when it wants to project power as an emerging global superpower. Its own maritime geography does not permit it to do that. So that's the Indian Ocean is where this great power contestation will probably take place in another 10 or 15 years from now. And third, and equally important, perhaps more important, is if China really wants to be a global superpower, it needs access to the Atlantic. And that access to the Atlantic, it gets through the Indian Ocean. So I think these 3 factors will decide China's posture in the Indian Ocean. India, being the leading maritime power in the Indian Ocean and largely uncontested so far, China will definitely seek to contain India in the Indian Ocean so that it can establish its own maritime dominance. So India has to guard against that and ensure that it always retains that maritime edge so that it can, as the leading Indian Ocean power, it can shape the future outcomes in the region and not allow itself to get shaped by them.
Thank you very much. And Kamlesh, one last point from your side as to what we can do to mitigate, and that's it.
Sir, we are doing a great job, particularly with regard to getting our space-based assets in place. And that is what is going to be, I would say, a game changer, because China is trying to change the game by using its space-based assets, by bringing in new series of Yaogan satellites, which look at theater level coverage with much lesser spatial interval and much lesser, I would say, time interval. So we have to look for something like that so that we are able to mitigate, if not counter their Chinese threat directly. So space-based assets is my choice.
Okay, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, the Indo-Pacific is a crucial area, and the time available is inversely proportional to the importance of the area. So I would like you to please join me in thanking our panelists for introducing us to the complexities of this game. Thank you.